Hello and welcome to Sake Revolution. This is America's first sake podcast. I'm your host, John Puma from the Sake Notes. Also, that internet sake Discord guy and the notable non-sake samurai on the show.
And I am your host, Timothy Sullivan. I am a sake samurai. I'm also a sake educator, as well as the founder of the Urban Sake website. And every week, John and I are here tasting and chatting about all things sake and doing our best to make it fun and easy to understand.
So, Tim, this is a rare treat. I want to say this is in just a handful of episodes. This is the second time I'm looking across the table and seeing your face.
I know, we're in person.
Yeah, we are in person. We are actually at the Samurai's Dojo. Is that what we're going to call this? No?
This is the Sake Revolution lair.
Oh, okay. I like lair. That works too. However, we are interestingly not alone. There's somebody else in the lair, Tim.
Yes, this is one of those VIP episodes.
Oh boy.
Excellent.
We are here with a very special guest, all the way from Tennessee, sake brewer and founder at Proper Sake Company, Byron Stithem.
Hey guys, thanks
Welcome,
for having me.
Byron.
Thank you for
Long
coming.
time listener,
Oh, excellent.
first time caller.
Yeah, so you are in a small band of very motivated sake people who are brewing sake in the U.S. Absolutely fantastic. And the first question that I want to ask you, I'm sure you get a lot. How did you get into sake?
You know, it's probably some sort of mental health issue, really. But as you guys know, sake is pretty great. It's probably the best beverage on the planet.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Yeah. So I actually fell in love with sake when I was living in New York, way back when. My background's in culinary science and fermentation. So the art of making sake, you know, forget about how great the finished product is very romantic on its own. So just the process is incredibly endearing, and also the finished product is a beautiful thing as well. So it's kind of a no-brainer. Nice.
And you mentioned that you did some studying of fermentation here in New York. Where did you study?
Well, so I worked at a bunch of different restaurants. Clover Club was the place I was at the longest. I lived over in Cobble Hill right by there, and just kind of wandered in one day and asked if I could have a job.
Famous last words. Awesome. So being a fan of sake and being in hospitality is one thing, but opening a sake brewery is a completely different ball of wax.
It is.
Walk us through that journey a little bit. How did you go from being a fan of sake to saying this is something I want to make and I want to make a career out of it?
Yeah. Well, I think especially too moving back to Tennessee, where there is a real dearth of interesting sakes. So if I wanted to drink Yamahai sake, the only way it was going to happen was if I made it. So that's really what prompted the high level experimentation. And then from there, I just knew that it was something I wanted to be able to share. And so, yeah, my business partner and I kicked the doors open in 2017. And it's just been a real journey ever since.
Nice. I like the idea of like, well, if I want to have sake over here, I'm going to have to do it myself. It's a good attitude, that pioneer spirit.
You know?
If you want it done right, you got to do it yourself.
Right. Now, I understand that you guys are opening up a new tap room over in Nashville. What's the scoop on that?
Yeah, so believe it or not, we're way behind schedule on it.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we have the new space open within the next 2 to 3 months, probably. Mm-hmm. It's on the east side of town, which is where I live. So that's really cool for me. The space is much larger, and we'll have a more amenable production facility, as well as a much more cohesive, shall we say, tasting area.
Now, in Nashville, I've never been. Have you been, John?
I have not been.
Okay. So we're completely ignorant here. What kind of reception does sake get in Nashville? Besides your operation, are there any other sake bars or good sake shops? What type of vibe does sake have in Nashville right now?
We're getting there. So starting to get some more interesting sakes. More importers are focusing a little more energy, but there's no specific sake-only bars, which I hope someone changes at some point. I mean, I guess you could consider ours a mostly sake bar.
Yeah.
But I'm excited for, the next Decibel to open in Nashville.
Decibel TN.
Yes. And then, shout out to Kinsey Hunter at Locust in Nashville. they're doing some really great stuff, and she certainly knows her way around some
Yeah,
sake.
she was my sake student at Sake School of America.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So she's
Awesome.
she's spreading the good word in Tennessee as well.
absolutely. What's the reaction been to the sakes that you're making?
Well, nobody has gagged or
All right.
vomited in my presence, so
This is what we like to hear.
that's been a win.
But I imagine that in a lot of cases, the people there, this may be their first encounter with sake. Is that? Do you find that's often what happens?
Yeah, very much so. And it's always kind of a weird introduction for folks too, because I do almost exclusively Yamahai styles.
Oh wow.
So not only is it folks' first introduction to sake, it's 9% of the sakes in the world, so I hear.
From reliable sources.
Reliable sources. I was way off on my estimation.
So yeah, I think Yamahai, when done correctly, or I don't want to say correctly, there's no right way to do anything,
Right.
but when done in a way that kind of brings together the harmony of the wild, lactobacillus and complexities with some of the beautiful ginjo ka that you can get from, a long, slow ferment. I think I've heard you say pretty Yamahai before, and that's always been my goal.
Yeah, sounds like you're chasing some depth of flavor there.
There's a nice intersection there somewhere, I think.
Great. It's really interesting that you're focusing on Yamahai so much.
Yeah. Well, I think specifically with Western cuisine, it shines a little bit less subtle
probably
in a
very
lot of
true.
ways, a little more acid.
And what, again, not very experienced with Nashville. What's like the local cuisine like over there?
We've gone through a bit of a renaissance over the last few years, so it's become super progressive, and there are a lot of Michelin quality restaurants that they're not getting Michelin stars in Tennessee yet, but someday.
Oh wow.
Some really great progressive cuisine where they're pulling from all over the place. So we also do a lot of fermentation and koji related production for different restaurants.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So not a whole lot of Japanese restaurants, but a lot of folks that are willing to put sake on the menu, even though it's probably not the first thing people think of when they go there.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So maybe you could walk us through a little bit of the different styles. You mentioned Yamahai already, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about the different styles that you make as far as your sake portfolio goes.
Yeah. So predominantly what we distribute is the sake that I brought for us to enjoy today. It's called the Diplomat. It's a Yamahai 60% mill rate. We do an agori of that as well. And that is predominantly what we distribute on site for tasting and just for drinking and consumption on premises. I'll do some more experimental stuff sometimes. And I'm very much into kind of unearthing old styles and recipes. So Kimoto, Bodaimoto,
Wow.
anything that I can dig up from the past, I'm very interested in. But I also love really beautiful, fruity, floral genjos and daigenjos. I'm in for anything, really.
Now, making all these different styles of sake, I'm wondering, we talked briefly a moment ago about studying fermentation. Like making Bodaimoto and all that stuff requires pretty deep study. Have you gone to Japan? And if so, tell us about your experience there.
Yeah. I've had the good fortune of going to Japan quite a few times now. And as this journey's progressed, more and more folks have been very open and kind with their resources and time and just education points, as it were. But yeah, some of my favorite breweries are, surprise, the ones that are doing a lot of Yamahai. But I really love Kito Izumi. I think they're making some really beautiful, as I mentioned, the intersection of Yamahai and, refined flavors. I think they do a wonderful job. Nita Hanke, similarly. I mentioned earlier I'm a Philip Harper fanboy for sure. Philip, if you're out there, sorry. Keep doing what you're doing.
And when you visit these breweries, they let you in on their secrets. They show you around, or is it just a polite tour? Or do you get to like stir the mash?
As time has progressed and people have realized that this isn't a joke,
Yeah.
I'm serious about making sake in Tennessee. People have been really forthright with a lot of information and resources. And it's been really wonderful to grow those relationships over the years.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I'd also be interested to know a little bit about your brewery setup that you have in Tennessee. I know that one thing I hear from brewers that are getting started in the States is that it may be difficult to source equipment and yeast and all that stuff. And I'm curious if you're doing that all yourself, brewing solo, and where did you get all the equipment that you work with, the tanks and the press and all that stuff? How did that come about for you?
Yeah, I think that is probably the ultimate challenge of American sake brewers, is assembling your equipment without access to what would be deemed traditional sake equipment.
Mm-hmm.
So tank-wise, it's all pretty similar. You can get jacketed tanks from pretty much anywhere at this point. That'll work for sake brewing for sure. So we have a handful of stainless steel tanks with jackets on them to control temperature. Our original pressing apparatus was a beekeeping table. So
what now?
Basically a stainless, is essentially a fune, but it's a stainless box and it had the false bottom. And so I had just rigged up a system to apply weight to the bags. Fortunately now we've been able to build a little more robust fune press. And actually my father-in-law helped assemble that one with his woodworking and metalworking knowledge. And so, yeah, we got a new fune press finally earlier this year.
Wow.
That was a big one.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as that, I mean, we have some wine and sake related lab equipment, and those are becoming more and more easily to come by. And you can certainly order those from Japan. Shipping is okay. It's once you start to get into large pieces of equipment that it gets a little costly.
Yeah. So you would say for any young people out there dreaming of opening a U.S. sake brewery that it takes some ingenuity.
Yeah. It helps if you have an engineering background, which I do not.
Good to know.
Yeah. If you can weld, you're going to be well ahead of the competition.
And that's in addition to the microbiology degree
right.
that you need.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, if you can read Japanese, that's
probably all right. So go read Japanese, learn welding, microbiology.
Yes.
The three steps.
Almost no barrier to entry here. Also, you have to be a lunatic. But, yeah.
Be a lunatic.
Along your whole journey, what would you say was the most difficult of all those stumbling blocks we talked about? What, for you personally, what was the most difficult to overcome?
I think there were a lot of unknowns. I wish I had more knowledge when I first started, but ultimately, a lot of learn as you go, and that's how we got there. But I do wish there was some more English language materials, and since then, I've been able to access more of that. But especially 10 years ago, there was really just like William Ald's Brewing Sake at Home book.
Yeah. It's changed I think in the United States, a lot of the landscape of sake in general, not just the local brewery scene, but acceptance, popularity, the volume that gets imported, like just the interest and awareness of sake has changed so much.
Truly.
And so, yeah, I would imagine that, as that grows, that those resources will become a little bit more available, which is nice.
Yeah.
I also think that a lot of the people on the Japanese side are realizing that, helping out breweries on this side and kind of making it so that people in America who have a first sake experience, that's a place like yours, have a great experience.
Yeah.
Do everything that they can to make sure that, and that's something that Kuji-san said when he was on our show, was that he wants to make sure that people here, when they're having sake for the first time, that's good.
Yeah.
And they want to, and he wants to encourage people to make good sake so that people here enjoy, have a good sake experience, and then they want to know more about sake and eventually try his sake.
That's right. And I think that's absolutely correct. And probably the largest reason that the Japanese brain trust has been as open as it has been. And it makes perfect sense. The sales and imports for sake in the U.S. are growing year over year. And the more that they can get people to drink sake and not taste really bad American sake and walk away from the beverage entirely, is it's in their best interest.
Absolutely. What was your first batch like?
Not the worst, actually.
So it was a later one that was the worst.
The first batch I made was in my basement, I guess probably about 12 years ago, in mason jars.
Oh, wow.
Really?
Using a cooler to inoculate koji in.
Oh my gosh.
And, when you're working in that small scale, if your recipe's right, it's not that hard. But to make really great sake, of course, requires infinite more knowledge and equipment than I had at that point.
Yeah. And was that after experimentation with beer, or did you go right to sake?
I've definitely made beer before, and I like beer. It's a nice thing, but it's not sake. It never will be.
So you clearly really love sake. Do you remember what your sake aha moment was? What you were drinking, where you were, anything like that?
Well, so Decibel is ground zero, of course, but there are probably a couple of moments along the way. As a teenager who was not old enough to drink, I may have come into some pretty cheap commodity sake, and I actually enjoyed it. So even as a young man, I was interested in sake, though I didn't know there was such an abundance of premium sake out there that deserved much more attention. But yeah, then when I moved to New York, the first time I went to Decibel, and the first time I had Yamahai sake was pretty eye-opening.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So Yamahai.
It was a Tengumai.
Oh, it was a Tengumai. We've had that on the show before.
We've had that on the show.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is not a beginner sake. We established that.
Yeah. I tend to prefer to be challenged in all arenas, especially when it comes to tasting food and beverage. So it was a no-brainer. What's the weirdest one you have? Give me that.
Wait a minute.
That's not something I usually say.
That's something my wife usually says. But what do you remember your first Yamahai then?
Oh, I don't remember my
Really?
first Yamahai. No. But
I remember mine.
let's hear it.
Yeah.
Tedorigawa Junmai.
Oh,
That's
was my
another good
first
one.
that's a pretty Yamahai.
Yeah. All their stuff is a little bit on that pretty Yamahai scale. Their Yamahai Daiginjo is like one of my absolute favorite sakes, though. It's so delicious.
Yeah.
I haven't had that in years, though. Really nice stuff.
Well, speaking of sake flavors, we have a sake that you've brought to us from Tennessee.
All the way.
And we are so excited to give it a try. So why don't we get that open? All right. So we have the sake here. Would you like to give us an introduction to the type and the statistics for this sake?
Yeah, for sure. So this is a Yamahai. It is made with Jupiter rice, which is a local Arkansas delicacy.
Jupiter? Like the planet?
I have never heard of that.
Me neither.
It's also referred to as somai sometimes.
I have heard of that.
okay.
Yes.
Got it.
So yeah, we get all the rice grown in Arkansas, and then Blake Richardson up at Motoe does the milling. And yeah, I really love this rice because it is unique to the area, but also has a similar structure and production capability as Yamada Nishiki. It's a Junmai Yamahai. It is also totally unfiltered, so
Okay.
Miroka.
Yep. So you don't mean cloudy by that. You mean not charcoal filtered.
Not charcoal filtered. There's no bentonite or fining agents. It's just straight off the press.
And the Somai Jupiter rice, what's the polishing rate on that?
It's a 60% polish, and then the SMV is about +2.
So looking at this in the glass, we have a little bit of just a hint of color there. I think that comes obviously from the lack of charcoal filtering.
Yeah.
So that would be Muroka.
I should mention it's also a Namachozo.
Namachozo.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's once pasteurized.
That's right.
All right. So let's give it a smell. Maybe you can walk us a little bit through the aroma and flavor.
Yeah. So it's a number 7 yeast.
Lovely aroma.
Which oftentimes can be more subdued compared to, some of its other contemporaries. But in the tank, it's pretty wild. Like cotton candy, watermelon, bubblegum. And then I think once it gets packaged in the bottle and pasteurized once, especially as it sits for a little bit, it starts to pick up some kind of tart cherry nose. And there's definitely a good acid content because of the Yamahai production method. So I think it's really great with grilled foods. We had it with barbecue yesterday at Brooklyn Kura, and I thought that was nice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lovely soft aroma, very delicate.
This has that pretty Yamahai aroma.
Thank you.
And there's a little bit of like banana aroma for me as well. Like a little
Absolutely.
like banana taffy kind of smell, a little bit of sweetness, really lovely, but soft and gentle. And there's also, I mean, staying with the aroma for just a moment, there's also a little bit of a floral note too.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
So this
white flower. It's really lovely.
This particular number 7 was donated by a brewery that will remain unnamed for their safety, but yeah, was really fortunate to come across it, and it is extremely foaming. So I've had a couple of mistakes in the past, but have figured it out now, of course. You got to leave a lot of headspace in that tank.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, so for our listeners, there are low foaming and regular foaming varieties of yeast. And if you have the regular foaming variety, during the most active stages of fermentation, the foam can bubble over the top of the tank and make a big mess.
It's a big mess. It turns to cement almost immediately.
And it is sticky too. It's like,
very much.
it's something you want to avoid for sure. All right, so let's give this a taste as well. Very excited.
Sorry, guys. I already started tasting.
That's okay. So did I. Yeah, this is, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but this is some Yamahai. Like, this is very easily recognizable as that style. And it is pretty, as you mentioned, it does have a little bit of a refinement to it. It's not just a super wild Yamahai. Usually not my style, the super wild ones. So I'm relieved. That's not really the phrasing I want to use. So I'm very pleased with that. That's nice.
Good. Well, yeah, I like I was saying, I think the intersection of some of the more interesting elements of Yamahai, especially, probably excessive umami in some cases, but generally a complex backbone and a little more acid than a lot of contemporary styles. So it does make it a little more versatile food-wise.
Yeah. And what's the alcohol percentage?
It's going to be a 16.
16.
Yeah.
All right. And I think when I taste this, I pick up a little bit on the tartness you were talking about, like the tart cherry. So towards the end, the not quite the aftertaste, but getting towards the back of the palate, this tartness really comes through. And that's really nice and brings kind of a crispness to the finish. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, thank you. And so the lactobacillus culture that we use basically propagated from multiple shubos. So over time, I did a bunch of rice experiments, getting different motos ready, and then we took the lactobacillus and isolated them. So it gets a defined lactobacillus to start. So in that regard, it is a little bit less traditional for the Yamahai, but it is still building its own lactic acid.
I want to ask you if you could give us your definition of what Yamahai is for our listeners.
Yeah.
Like if a customer walked in and you said this is a Yamahai and they say, what's that? We've described it here on the podcast, but I'd love to get your take on how do you describe Yamahai for folks?
Well, you guys did it much more eloquently than I would be able to, I'm sure. But when folks come in, I kind of try and meet them where they are. So it could go any number of ways.
Yeah.
If it's somebody that doesn't seem like they have a long attention span, I'll try and make it akin to more of a natural wine or something with an ambient production or non-refinement. Basically, building your lactic acid culture naturally instead of adding. Then, of course, if folks really want to get into the weeds, we can.
Yeah. How would you explain it for someone who might say, listen to a sake podcast?
Oh, boy. This is why I don't have my own podcast. But, yeah, I mean, you definitely want to start with the Shubo conversation. And all roads lead from there, essentially. So, essentially telling people, like, you got to get your yeast going before it's going to make anything good. So, how are you going to do that?
Yeah.
Yamahai is the way I like to do it. And because you get the refined mix of bugs that collect themselves in there before things get going, and it adds some complexity to the finished product.
Great. Awesome. Very cool.
You mentioned like the tartness and the acidity, and I feel like they're doing a nice little dance here, and it's really like everything's just really complimentary, which I really like.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's got some funky, unusual flavors, but they're like nothing is overshadowing the rest of the experience. That's been something I'm really enjoying about this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And when it comes, you mentioned barbecue before, but when it comes to food pairing, as a brewer, the maker of this sake, what are some of your recommendations for pairing this particular Junmai Yamahai?
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, I think anything grilled goes pretty famously. Anything that's received some sort of Bernoulli effect, gentle charring.
Gentle charring.
Gentle charring.
Which can come in any number of forms, of course. But yeah, I think the umami and any savory notes are very complementary with that. Also, grilled oysters are a really nice time. I think oysters are obviously famous with sake for a lot of reasons, but when you get that grilled element, you also kind of combine the best of both worlds.
Now, I'm curious to ask you, since you get so many consumers coming in off the street who have never had sake before, and this is a delicious premium sake, handcrafted and bright and vibrant right out of the press. Have there been any funny comments you remember that people have said to you, or any like hot takes that your customers had?
You know, I'm never surprised by the amount of strange questions that get asked, or tasting notes that just would never have come to me.
Yeah.
And probably for a good reason, but you know, cinnamon and whiskey. Like, this is a whiskey, right? It says it on the sign, guys. That's a sign. You're in the wrong place.
I've never gotten whiskey from a sake before.
I think that one's out of bounds.
Yeah, I certainly don't get cinnamon from this.
I think somebody was visiting Nashville and had had a lot of Fireball, probably.
Okay.
And everything was going to taste like that for the rest of their trip.
You know, that happens. So we're having this chilled right now, but being a Yamaha, I have to ask, do you have any temperature preferences outside of that?
Yeah. This is a great question. And another reason that I think Yamahai is, I don't want to say superior, but it does have characteristics that make it a little more shelf stable, a little more indestructible.
A little more indestructible.
Yeah.
There's that word.
There
That's
it
that
is.
word.
It has that acid content, so it ages really well. And for that reason, also does well with heat. So I love this chilled, but I also, sometimes I'll throw in an ice cube. That's a Philip Harper trick.
It is.
He
said he's a fanboy. Let him have it.
Let me go. But yeah, I love it heated as well. And even a little bit warmer than a lot of people probably
Wow.
suggest. But I think it has an interesting nuance throughout the spectrum. And I think there's somewhere in there that would be amenable to almost anyone. So
Nice.
Yeah.
That's always a lot of fun. When you encounter like the real nerdy sake places that'll always want to play with temperature and things like that. And I can imagine, like, I've been to places in like parts of Japan where I'm like, I know specific like proprietors that would have a ball with this sake and have a blast with what they can do with different temperatures with it.
Yeah. Have you ever brought your sake to Japan and poured it for other brewers? What have they said?
Well, just inherently, the Japanese are very polite. So it's hard to say if I've received any real critique, but I certainly make sure to preface the fact that it is a Yamahai and like it's supposed to taste like that.
Yeah.
It's supposed to.
At least that's my intention. I think the folks that do Yamahai have been pleasantly surprised that anybody would be dumb enough to do it in the States, but also that it's hopefully somewhat palatable and somewhat in line with some sakes that they might make themselves. So last year, right before the pandemic, actually, I went to Nizawa, and they don't do any Yamahai. Like it's the exact opposite of what I do, essentially. But really incredible sake, and they make some of the most just crushable, beautiful, not too in your face aroma wise, just infinitely drinkable sakes. And so I learned a lot from them.
Yeah.
But they definitely put my stuff through the lab testing ringer and
Oh, wow.
did all of the analysis for me.
You know, I like to say breweries like that, they wouldn't touch Yamahai with a 10-foot pole. That's a sake brewery joke.
Yeah, I get it.
There's going to be some eye rolls on the other end of this somewhere, huh?
One of the great things about sake is that you can process it post-fermentation, and there's lots of things you can do. You can age it, you can pasteurize it in different ways, you can add water or not. Are you experimenting with any other processes for this particular Yamahai Junmai, like aging or anything like that?
Yeah, so I try and pull off a little bit of every batch to age.
Cool.
I love koshu as well. Surprise. But so I do try and save some sake. And I do have some original, this recipe that I started working on probably 8 or 9 years ago. I have some bottles still in the fridge that I sample regularly.
Oh, that's cool.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And I also do a project where I have a small tank that I throw a little bit of each batch in.
Ooh.
And so it's always near the top. So I'll pull a little bit off, a few bottles to put the next batch in. Call it time lapse. So it's
I like that idea.
a picture in time.
That's pretty cool.
Very cool. Now, are you aging all those sakes in bottle, the ones that you set aside? Is it all aged in bottle or?
Yeah, so those are all in bottle with the exception of that time-lapse project.
Time-lapse.
This particular sake we're drinking was pressed in November of 2020. So
Oh, wow. So you mentioned earlier that you're also attracted to like Himoto, Bodaimoto. Have you done any production on those yet? Or is that still
nothing
something
for
it's-
distribution, but certainly for the tasting room. And especially over the pandemic, I did a lot of experimentation. Mixed culture brews and certainly anything that builds a natural lactic acid profile. So we did plenty of Bodaimotos.
Everybody else is making sourdough.
Liquid sourdough.
There you go.
Somebody has to.
Right?
Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much for bringing this amazing Junmai Yamahai. It is an absolute treat to be able to taste it and also taste it with the maker. Thank you so much.
Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you guys so much for doing what you do, and thanks for letting me join today.
Now, for our listeners who are interested in trying proper sake, where can they find you? Where can they first find your products? And then where can they find more information about you online?
Yeah, so we do have a website, propersake.co. We currently distribute to 9 states, so Tennessee, sort of Kentucky, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, DC, Maryland, Virginia, and looking to get into the New York market pretty soon.
Oh, that's awesome.
We will also be launching an online store where we should be able to ship direct to about 46 states. But the
That's
best way to
great.
drink the sake is obviously on site. So come see us in Nashville.
Yeah. And if people want to learn more about your tap room that's opening up, they can just visit your website, propersake.co, right?
That's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here, taste your sake. I've been seeing you online and in sake circles for a long time, and it's so nice to meet you in person.
Likewise.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we want to thank our listeners as well for tuning in. We really do hope that you're enjoying Sake Revolution. Now, if you'd like to show your support for our podcast, there's one way you can really help us out, and that would be to join us on Patreon. We have 2 different levels of support that you could help us out with. The first one is $5 a month, and for that, you can join our monthly live Zoom Sake Happy Hour. It happens the first Wednesday of every month. You can join us live and sip with us, ask us questions, and we can't wait to meet you. And the second tier is our $3 a month. And for that tier, we can give you some inside intel and let you know which sakes we'll be sipping on 2 weeks in advance if you'd like to get them for yourself and sip along with us when the episode comes out.
And believe it or not, there's another way you can support the podcast, and that is by writing a review on Apple Podcasts. Still, you guys would not believe how much of an impact that actually has. And then after you're done writing your wonderful review, please tell your friends, tell your family, get them to subscribe.
And as always, to learn more about any of the topics, any of the brewers, or any of the sakes we talked about in today's episode, just visit our website, sakerevolution.com, and you can check out all the detailed show notes.
And if you have sake questions that you need answered, we definitely want to hear from you. Please reach out to us. The email address, as always, is feedback@sakerevolution.com. So, until next time, please pick up a glass, keep drinking sake, and Kanpai.